Let this meeting come to order. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I can think of no more important work than what we can do to help our families get out of poverty. I say that as somebody who was born in this state and who came from an immigrant family that was on public assistance, and there were times when we didn't know how we were going to eat. And most of the programs that we'll talk about today have been programs that have touched my life and the life of my family and the people who I represent. So it was with that as framing that I want us to do the hard work to make sure that we do everything that we can to help California families to be able to live a better life and have economic sufficiency and strength. So I look forward to our conversation. I'm excited to call up our first panel. I'm honored that we're joined by Secretary Dooley, and we look forward to a few remarks from the Secretary. Welcome, Madam Secretary. We'd like you to come forward. We'd like to ask the other panelists to come forward. Mr. Woolsey, Chris Haney, Michelle Stillwell-Parvensky, and Mr. Will Lightbourne. As they come forward, let us welcome our Secretary, and we would appreciate it if you would share a few remarks with us.
Thank you so much. I'll just speak with you. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It has been my pleasure to have the opportunity to begin our acquaintance, and I am delighted to work with you on this important subject. I share your passion for support for the vulnerable. I come from a family not too different than your own, and so whether we know it firsthand or we know it through the work that we do, I think certainly we in this administration share the commitment to doing all that we can. We've come through a very difficult budget period. The first 2 years in this job, I many days wished I hadn't said yes. It was very, very painful. We took $2 billion out of this program, and they were very consequential reductions, and we haven't restored them. And so the pain and the suffering of the community that are served by these important programs persists. And as the governor pointed out in his extemporaneous remarks when the budget was presented, regrettably, they have been with us for a very long time. I recently watched the PBS program on the Roosevelts and the period of the Great Depression, the period of the Great Society and the war on poverty. Unfortunately, we haven't won that war. And as much progress as we make, there's still more work to do. So I share your commitment, and I appreciate your comments. The work of this agency spans 16 departments and programs, and they are all in one way or another involved with the lives of the families that need the most help in our society. Gratefully, we aren't in a position of cuts. We have begun to look at ways that we can reform programs and make them stronger. And as there is revenue available, we want to spend it wisely, and we want to do the greatest good for the greatest number. You heard from some of our departments last week. I regret that I couldn't be here to open your first subcommittee hearing. It is my pleasure to work with so many committed people in this administration. Our departments and the people that they lead care deeply about these programs. We have made great progress in the coverage expansion, both through the Covered California insurance product and by bringing more than 2 million people into the Medi-Cal program, and that number continues to grow. There are a number of significant administrative and operational challenges to making an expansion of this size and scope, but we are working very hard and across lines to do that as well. We do have some fiscal challenges this year. We have been funded to a pretty significant degree agree by a tax on the managed care, the Medi-Cal managed care plans, and that tax is going to expire in the next year. And so we are working with our stakeholders and with you and your colleagues to find a replacement revenue source. We also have the expiration of our 1115 waiver, which is essentially a contract between the states and the federal government. It was a 5-year contract that expires in the fall, and we are actively engaged in restoring that, which is critically important for our safety net. So there are some critical budget issues that we will face together this year and address them. The governor's budget, as always, is an opening bid, if you will, in this process. It's our best effort to make the priorities and allocate the resources that we have forecast. Your legislative analyst does its forecast. We work together for 6 months, and we are very proud that for the first 4 years we've passed an on-time budget. I fully expect that we will again this year, and we stand ready to work with you to resolve our differences, reconcile the areas of information and data and come to the places where we can agree. Director Lightbourne is an extraordinary leader. I was so deeply grateful to him for coming from Santa Clara County. He served 3 counties in California. Everyone told me he was the dean of the county welfare organizations, and certainly he has been a very trusted advisor to the governor and a very close colleague with me. He has some proposals this year that were embodied in the governor's budget, and he'll go through them with you. But I certainly share his commitment and his passion for the work that we do in addressing the assistance programs that are provided by his department that you will hear from today. So I'd be happy to answer any specific questions, but I really wanted to be here simply to assure you that we stand ready to work together and do all we can to address this important subject area.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I appreciate your presence, your remarks, and your partnership. And I know that there'll be lots of conversation, sometimes easy, sometimes tough, but I know that we're committed to doing this work together. And I look forward to it. I would like to ask if you'd say a little bit more about the 1115 waiver.
Sure.
Just give me a better sense, in all of us, about how it's crafted. I come from the world of serving foster youth, and so when I would hear about the waiver, that meant something in the counties that I served in. Fortunately, I served in a county that had received the waiver and was allowed to use dollars more flexibly, but I'm not familiar with how 1115 is crafted. Is it the same, between every state and the federal government, or is it customized specifically to our needs in California? And if so, what programs are most impacted by it?
Well, there are several waivers, and the federal Medicaid program isn't one Medicaid program. It's really 50 Medicaid programs. Unlike Medicare, which is 100% funded by the federal government and it's managed by the federal government, the Medicaid program is a partnership within the states, and each state has a different relationship to the federal government. From the base funding, we're a 50-50 state, so we put up $1 and we get $1. Mississippi, for example, is 73% funded by the federal government. So they put up 27 cents and they get 73 cents back, and it varies between those ranges. And that's the basic Medicaid program. And then we have state plans, and the state plans have certain conditions associated with them. So we talk about state plan amendments, and in the vernacular of this, they call them SPAs. And then we have waivers, and there are a number of different kinds of waivers. The waiver for foster care is different from the 1115 waiver that I mentioned before, and Will can talk about our waiver relationships and where we stand on that. The 1115 waiver that I'm speaking about is the largest amount of federal funding that we get, and it's a demonstration project, and we've had demonstration projects for 20 years now, and they go in 5-year increments. And the one that we negotiate, the last administration negotiated in 2010, set up the framework for our implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And in that waiver, the local health plans, the LIP program, the local initiative program that advanced those who would be eligible for Medicare, Medi-Cal. Last January, they came into the program early through that waiver. There were delivery system improvement plans with the county hospitals that were in that waiver. All of that expires, and for perspective, it's about $2 billion a year in federal funds to California, and it supports that safety net. The process of negotiating the waiver is also complicated. We have had almost a year-long process with our concept paper and stakeholder engagement, and that's coming to a conclusion. We expect to submit our waiver proposal to the federal government in March. And then we began a negotiation on the federal side on the terms of the waiver, and in the legislature with the enabling legislation that will be required to implement it. And hopefully those will come together at the end of the session in the fall. There are two parts of the proposal fundamentally. There's the how we get the money and what we do with it, and the how we calculate the amount of money that is allowable is not just on what we can defend, on what we will do with it. The need is great, and we can always make a case for how we will use the money. But there are a number of rules in the federal government that govern how we can defend the maximum amount that we can get. There's a budget neutrality calculation, and there are issues that we are working with them on to get the maximum flexibility on that. And we have a proposal that is an innovation. As you might expect, California is an innovative state, and we are proposing something that they haven't done before in a shared savings proposal. So that's going to be difficult, and it's going to require some concerted effort to persuade them that this is good for the long-term health of the program for them as well as us. So we'll have a lot more conversation about the details of the 1115 waiver, but that's the basic framework.
Thank you, and we look forward to an ongoing conversation. You're always welcome at this committee, especially if you're bringing good news.
Thanks.
But regardless of the news, you're always welcome at this committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Let
us get under.
Turn over to Will.
I'm sorry?
I'll turn it over to the rest of
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. We're looking forward to a number of panel discussions today, and our panelists who are here. I just want to share with you what the committee has set as a priority. We want to, hear from all the important stakeholders in the public. We want to do our work in a way that's most efficiently. I ask that you give us your remarks as briefly as you can, so that we can spend the balance of our time on the questions and answers. So appreciate that. We will have public comment, 1 minute each for each speaker, and so that we can get through all of the materials that we have here today. So with that, we have a number of folks. Mr. Woolsey is here, Mr. Haney, Michelle Stilwell-Parvensky from Children's Defense Fund, and Mr. Lightbourne. Mr. Lightbourne, would you like to open with some remarks?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me sort of add my apologies also to the secretaries for not having been at last week's hearing on the last hearing on child welfare. We were both scheduled for the same meeting in the East Coast. Briefly, just respond to the question on the waiver that you posed to the secretary, Mr. Chair. The child welfare waiver, Title 4E waiver, initially was 2 counties, Alameda and Los Angeles, of course. And last October, we expanded it to 9 counties that represent slightly over half of the state's caseload. That the new waiver is a 5-year waiver. It'll run through 2019. Terms and conditions were, we think, positive to the state. They also provided for the possibility of reconsideration of some areas if circumstances change, so that we feel the state's interests are protected. So I just wanted to update you on that. To the broader topic of addressing poverty in California, to state the obvious, and as the Secretary did, we start with the governor's budget as proposed, but we also fully know and expect we'll be very engaged with the committee, with your staff, with advocates who are our partners across the state. I see many in the room, from grassroots groups like Parent Voices that we work with very closely, and others, as we move forward to consider sort of a range of issues and interests people may have. To quickly sort of hit the sort of the scope of the problem, California has a poverty rate, both overall and especially for children, that is severe, and it's something which legitimately occupies a great concern for the state and civil society together. Coupled with the underlying sort of changes in our national economy over the last 3 decades, the sort of severe dislocations that came from the recession, and then California's extraordinary housing costs. We wind up with rates that far exceed, by the adjusted basis, national standards. I just want to take a few minutes to consider 2 dimensions of how we're looking at this. The first is, what is the state doing and what can the state do to reduce the poverty rate itself? And then the second is, what can the state do, what is the state doing with our partners to mitigate the impacts of poverty on those who feel it most acutely? On the first aspect, when we talk about reducing the poverty rate, whether we're talking about the California poverty measure at 26% or the supplemental poverty measure at 24%, or the official poverty measure, the so-called FPL at 16%, there are basically 2 things that can happen. There can be significant income transfers, either through tax systems or cash payments, or we can make the economy work better for people, or a combination of both. We know that there's a great deal of interest among leading advocates and here in the legislature around proposals having to do with tax code changes and looking at issues of the grant levels. We fully expect to be working with interested parties to sort of look at the impacts, the advantages, and the results. The thing I would emphasize is that while those will have effects all across the low-income spectrum, the actual percentage that will exit quote-unquote poverty by the CPM or the SPM standards is low with those tools. That isn't to say we shouldn't do it. We should do what we can do to minimize impacts, but at the same time, when we say reduce poverty, I just want us to be clear that we're not setting a metric that we will never feel that we've made any headway on. The second part, and then the other part, of course, is making the economy work for people, which sort of is, from our perspective, is a matter of aligning the access, the preparation of people who are unemployed, underemployed, or employed but at wages that don't permit them to support their families in dignity, aligning their needs with the labor market as it is recovering so that they benefit from it. Part of that is increasing the minimum wage, and as you know, the state's done so in 2014 and will do again in January 2016. Parallel to that is investing in aligning and coordinating the resources for adult education, job-related instruction, and focusing our efforts on emerging jobs and tying in with post-secondary education, non-traditional apprenticeships. So in addition to the investments we'll discuss in the next section of the agenda under the specific programs that we operate, the governor's budget proposal includes $500 million in Prop 98 General Fund, block grant for adult education with emphasis on job skill development, $250 million as block grant for career technical education, an increase of $14 million for the existing apprenticeship programs, and an additional $15 million for new apprenticeship programs in the emerging industries. as the governor's budget calls forth, it requires that workforce investment agencies, labor agencies, adult education agencies, K-12, and notably social services, both at the state and local levels, collaborate in a sort of a joint process to look at how we align those resources as well as the resources that are already in our system to really benefit people. An example of that, not to make it abstract, would be sort of aligning our subsidized employment with the on-the-job training apprenticeship opportunities that are being developed. The effects of these efforts and also the local control funding formula, redirection of resources to high-need areas of the state will take time to be felt. And the people who are suffering can't wait while we take that time. It will ultimately bend the curves, but not instantly. And that's what takes us to both ensuring that that low-income people get access to programs like Medicaid through ACA and like the CalFresh program, SNAP program, as well as focus an additional lens on those most at risk as a result of poverty. Prioritizing is never something that is easy for any of us, least of us those in the helping professions. For my purposes, the focus has to be on children in deep poverty. That has to be our command because we know the toxic effects of deep poverty. We know the effects, the neurological effects, the developmental effects, the fact that whole lifetimes are affected. To best meet their needs, we have to provide income supports at the level that the legislature and administration agree we can best afford. Recognize that among the worst effects of deep poverty on children is instability. And in our context in California, housing instability runs to the forefront of that and driving other instabilities, family composition instabilities, et cetera. So to the extent we can provide services that stabilize housing and to the extent that we can nuance our cash assistance and support to best meet the needs of housing-challenged families is certainly something we intend to work on. Children also need to be in homes where parents have the time, the resources, and the skills and supports for effective parenting, and looking to efforts like home visiting, parent engagement, early intervention are all, I think, part of the agenda we have to be working on together. When you consider what has been invested in recent times, the family stabilization component of CalWORKs, the large investment in subsidized employment in CalWORKs so that people whom employers might be reluctant to hire, that we share the cost and help them into permanent employment. And then the housing support program, the rapid rehousing to help families that are on CalWORKs who are actively facing homelessness. We have in place, I think, the makings of all that an ideal program would look like. It's not done, and it'll never be done. I don't think there'll ever be a moment where we say, this is our perfect work of art, let's stop. Our knowledge will increase, our knowledge about individuals in need of services will increase, our ability to coordinate those with other education, supportive, and employment systems will always increase, and we will continue to treat our program, our efforts, our work as an administration in the developmental spirit that our families are and the kids we want to serve are. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Lightbourne. Don't go anywhere. We're going to have a few questions for you.
Sure.
But I do want to thank you for giving us that overview, and because it was high level and touched on really the framing about what state strategies can do to reduce poverty. I want to bring in our other panelists, and I'm going to now push us to move quickly quickly and to really just get through it quickly so we can get to the questions and answer period of the conversation. I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Assemblymember Bonta, who's joined us. And with that, I'll ask Clerk if you would take the roll, please.
Thurman,
Here.
Bonta,
Here.
Chu, Grove, Jones.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Woolsey is here from the LAO's office. You're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan Woolsey from the Legislative Analyst's Office. I'll be speaking from a handout that the Sergeant should have distributed to you. In the summer of 2014, the legislature directed our office to analyze options looking at costs, benefits, and trade-offs for a state earned income tax credit. And pursuant to that direction, we released a report in December that presents 3 options for the legislature's consideration, and I'll be speaking on those options today. On page 1 of the handout, we'll begin with some background on the federal earned income tax credit, or EITC. The federal EITC is a fully refundable income tax credit that reduces tax liability for filers that have earnings. It is structured so that as income increases, the amount of credit increases. As you can see on the figure on the bottom of page 1, there's a phase-in range where additional earnings result in additional credit. At a certain point, you hit a flat range where additional earnings don't affect the level of the credit, and then the credit gradually phases out where additional earnings will reduce the amount of the credit. Because the credit is fully refundable, taxpayers with small liabilities can still receive the full value of their credit. Any excess credit is provided in the form of a tax refund. The federal EITC has several effects. First, by directly providing resources to low-income families, it moves people above poverty thresholds. Under the Census Bureau's supplemental poverty measure, we estimate that in 2012, the EITC provided resources to keep about 750,000 Californians above the poverty line. But that is an understatement of the full effect of the credit because it's also been shown to result in increased work participation, which also increases resources in families and helps bring people above the poverty line. On the next page, we show that many states have enacted earned income tax credits that build on the federal credit. Almost all of these piggyback on the federal credit, which means that they set their eligibility requirements to be the same as the federal credit and then match a certain percentage. That percentage can range anywhere from 3.5% in Louisiana, this is for 2014, all the way up to 40% in the District of Columbia. Most of these credits are refundable, but some of them are not. On page 3, we note that if California were to enact a state EITC, its structure would depend on what goals the legislature wanted to achieve by such a credit. And 3 potential policy goals that we raise are: first, to further encourage work; second, to supplement the resources of families at specific income levels. This could be low income or higher income. And lastly, to fill in perceived gaps in the federal EITC. The amount of the EITC varies by the number of children that a filer has, dependent children. And the amount of credit that's provided to filers with no dependents is notably quite smaller than for filers with children. And many have noted that that's a discrepancy that should be looked at. Once the goals are clear for the legislature, there are several key decision points in designing the EITC. The state would have to decide whether the credit would piggyback on the federal credit or whether we would try to develop an alternative schedule that would focus on one population or another. We would have to decide if the credit should be refundable or not. I'll note that because filers in California that are eligible for the federal EITC have very low state income tax liabilities, a non-refundable credit will be limited in its effect. And lastly, the state could choose what total level of funding in the form of foregone income tax revenues it would want to devote to an EITC, and an EITC could be structured to fit within a target funding amount. So on page 5, we'll turn to the first of our options. Option 1 is a piggyback on the federal credit that would be equal to 15% of the federal EITC amount. As you can see in the figure, it builds on the amount of the federal credit at every income level. This option is mostly associated with our first policy goal that we identified of encouraging work, but it also would have the effect of reducing poverty. Specifically, we estimate that if this credit had been around in 2012, about 10 million individuals would have been in households that would have benefited, and of those, about 120,000 would have moved above the poverty threshold. As we mentioned, this would increase incentives to work, both going to part-time and going to full-time. The Franchise Tax Board estimates that an option similar to Option 1 would cost about $20 million a year in administrative costs. And we estimate that if it had been available again in 2012, the foregone income tax revenue would have been about $1 billion. On page 7, Option 2 would focus on families with the lowest incomes by matching the federal EITC up to a certain level and then phasing out, specifically before the point at which the highest federal EITC benefit is reached. This is an example of the second policy goal that we raised, targeting resources to a specific income level, in this case low income. We estimate that if it had been available in 2012, 2.7 million Californians would have been in households that would have benefited, and of them, 45,000 would have moved above the poverty threshold. Option 2 would significantly increase incentives to move to part-time work, but because it phases out relatively quickly in terms of additional earnings, it would actually reduce incentives to move to full-time work and would have no effect on incentives going from no work to full-time work. FTB estimates that this would cost $7 million a year to administer, and for 2012 would have resulted in about $450 million in foregone revenues. On page 9, we have Option 3, which would supplement the federal EITC for filers with no dependents. It would essentially match the amount of the federal credit that's available now for filers with no dependents, such that if you combined the state and federal credits, it would be about twice as large, and it would be available over a longer spectrum, a larger spectrum of earnings than the current federal EITC is. Because it's focusing on filers with no dependents, it would not be available for filers with dependents, which is the majority of individuals and filers who receive the federal credit. We estimate that roughly 3.2 million individuals would have benefited from an option like this in 2012, 21,000 of which would have moved above poverty thresholds. This option, similar to Option 2, would increase incentives to work part-time, but not as much full-time because it phases out relatively quickly, and would cost roughly $14 million a year to administer. The foregone revenue from this option is roughly $400 million. Again, that's a 2012 number. I'll conclude with some final things to consider about these options on page 11. First, these options could be mixed and matched. And what I mean by that is that the legislature could take any of these options and just implement them if they suited the goals of the legislature. On the other hand, you could take aspects of one option or another and combine them. For example, greatly focusing the benefits on the low-income side of the spectrum while also increasing maximum benefits, as is done in Option 1. That's something that the legislature could do. The next thing I'll note is that it's well documented that the federal EITC has significant issues with improper payments, which is a situation that arises when a filer claims more, or in some cases less, in federal EITC than they're actually eligible for. This can be for a variety of reasons, ranging from confusion about the complexity of the federal credit and how children that live in multiple households should be treated, to deliberate misrepresentation on the part of filers or tax preparers. Should the state enact an EITC, we think it would be important to consider ways to limit these improper payments so that the benefits go to the families and childless adults that are eligible. Finally, in 2010, the Internal Revenue Service estimated that only 71% of Californians that are eligible for the federal EITC actually claimed it. The state has pursued efforts in the past to increase participation in the federal EITC, and if the state were to enact a state EITC, it would also want to consider whether additional efforts are warranted to maximize participation and the effects of both the federal and state EITCs. And I'd be happy to take any questions now or later that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Woolsey. We will give the other panelists a moment to give us a quick overview, but thank you for your thorough review. I am aware that the subcommittee had asked for this information last year, and that you've probably been waiting a long time to present it. We appreciate you bringing it to us, as this is a conversation that I would say is a high priority for us at this time. And we look forward to a few questions and answers with you shortly. Thank you.